This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Institute of Historical Research. My name is Lawrence Goldman, I'm the director here, and I'm really only the warm-up act for the serious historians to come. I do want to welcome you and hope that you'll stick with us, because this is a series of seminars running through the winter, one a month in the middle of the month from now until March, when we will hear from many of the leading figures in our profession. So do, as it were, keep coming, and please tell your friends. I'm glad to see you, in fact, because Senate House has been overcome by a film crew, a large film crew. I'm told Brad Pitt is the centre of it all, but I've yet to see him, and he's not here, as far as I know. Now, it's very much the purpose of the IHR to really be a centre for history, both academic history and history in the public. Last week we had a lecture, an endowed lecture on public history, and this week we've turned, if you like, to taking the pulse of academic history, though we're doing it in a variety of ways, and I hope we're looking outwards as well. But it's very much part of our role, I think, for the history community in Britain to act as a centre for discussion on where we are, where we've got to. Now, I can't claim originality for what we're about to do. 14 years ago, in 2001, a previous director, David Cannadine, organised a series of seminars with a very similar title, I think it's fair to say, on the state of history, and took the pulse of our subject. He and his contributors did it in a slightly different way, with lectures on what was political history and what was social history and what was intellectual history, and a fine book emerged from it. We're doing it in a slightly different way, thinking about issues and themes and questions and problems that face academic historians in their writing and in their outreach today. But as it were, I don't claim originality, but I do think that periodically it's required that we stop and think about the things that we're doing and compare notes and, if you like, politely argue among ourselves. Now, I'm delighted to hand over to Dan Snowman, who has really been the brains behind this. Dan is a senior research fellow here at the IHR and a very great supporter of our work. And Dan will introduce the speakers and tell you some more. Dan, thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. I used to work for the BBC, and I always believe you should have a microphone. I've got one on, whether it's working or adding anything to what I'd be saying anyway. And I'm going to invite the speakers in a moment to use the microphone. So is that kind of volume about right? Good. So, as Lawrence said, welcome to the IHR and the beginning of this series of seminars on history now and then. We've called it History Now and Then because the overall theme is how we, in the present, regard, disregard, use, abuse the past. And we're going to kick off in a few moments with what seems to be an extraordinary paradox. There's a huge amount of history around. It's very popular on television, books, the heritage visits, family history, etc. And yet, I sense that very frequently people, maybe all of us, live in a kind of bubble of the immediate present. Is that a paradox? That's what we're really going to explore this evening. Just before I introduce it in a little more detail, just a word or two about the series as a whole. As Lawrence said, we meet every 4 weeks, right through the winter. This is the first of 6. And in the course of the next 5 seminars, there'll be one on the whole heritage issue, which will be a very lively one in a month's time. We're then moving on to talk something about the myths of history. We probably all need an element of mythologizing of the past. Does that matter? In the early new year in January, we'll explore whether there really is such a thing as the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Isn't that what we historians try to achieve? In which case, why does every generation need to rewrite the history of the past? In my own work, I've been interested in the relationship between the arts and history, and we will examine that in the fifth of the seminars. To what extent can a great artwork help lead you on a pathway towards understanding the past, or to what extent might it not inhibit real understanding of the past? And then in the final seminar in March, what is it about history that so excites those who are keen on it? Or what do we look for in it? Is it consolation? Is it identity? Is it vindication? Is it an individual or a national thing? And indeed, where does it go from here? If I remember to, and if we have the time, in the final seminar, I'm going to press the panel we have then into saying, well, you know, if we had this again in another 14 years' time, Lawrence, what would history have become by then? We've had social history, the linguistic turn, the cultural turn. What would be the next historiographical turn we should be looking forward to over the next decade or so? So it's going to be a very lively and exciting, I hope, series of seminars. And what, as I say, what we're going to settle on today is the issue of this, what seems to me a great paradox. Huge amount of interest in history, and yet at the same time, you know, when you think of the way current issues are debated, whether it's to do with Russia and Ukraine or migration, or whether we should be in or out of the EU or whatever it might be, very often issues are discussed almost as though there was no historic backstory to them. There always is. Everything in the present is the product of all that has preceded it. And how should we regard the past? Do we misregard the past? What is the role of the historian in trying to get it right? Now, we have a very distinguished panel for the opening seminar, and in a moment I'm going to ask each of them to talk for about 10 minutes, and then after that we will open it for general discussion. And if I may just say a word or two by way of introduction, and I'm going purely alphabetically. I'm going to start with H, which is Ronald Hutton, sitting here. When I first knew Ronald, he's Professor of History at Bristol. I first knew him 25, 30 years ago, and I thought of him as being very expert on the Restoration, Charles II, and so on. And he was beginning to work then also on the rituals, the annual rituals of Merry England, a very important book that he went on to write. Magic. I remember in the BBC we did some programs on the decline of the idea of magic. He's written on witchcraft, druids, shamanism, paganism, and so on, and much else. Paul Lay is editor of History Today. When I first knew Paul, he was one of the co-founders, I think, Paul, of the BBC History magazine. And I remember we also had dealings at one stage when Paul was in charge of obits in The Guardian, and we made each other at that stage. As the editor of History Today, and an extremely fine editor of a magazine called History Today, Paul is extremely well equipped to talk about precisely the topic of today's seminar. One of the things that he wrote not very long ago was a book or a long essay which is on easily downloadable online. I strongly recommend it, called History Today and Tomorrow. Just want to quote a little bit the way Paul kicks that off. History calls everything into question. It offers no comfort, no shelter, no respite. It's a discipline of endless revision and argument. History opposes hubris and warns of nemesis. Wise word, but it does make me wonder why you like history so much, Paul. David Reynolds, Professor of International History at Cambridge, a Fellow of Christ, until recently Head of History at Cambridge. You'll surely know David from his many, many wonderful radio and television broadcasts, and his books, something like a good dozen or so of them, concentrating for the most part, I think it's fair to say, David, on war and peace in the 20th century. Recent book, The Long Shadow, wonderful book, is a fascinating account of the ways in which the First World War has been perceived and maybe misperceived over the course of the centuries since. He's very expert on American history, and it strikes me, David, that I've been talking about the Brits so far, but the Americans too. Very preoccupied with the sort of heroes and grandees of the past, the 150th anniversary of the death of Lincoln and Reconstruction and so on, and yet current debates and issues are very often conducted as though there weren't a serious backstory. I may be wrong about that, but maybe something that we'll raise during the course of the evening. And finally to Pat Thane. Pat, like David, is a modernist, if I can put a crude label on her work, professor of contemporary history at King's, but she's also had posts at Goldsmiths, at Sussex, and indeed here, I think Pat at the IHR. If I were to try and sum up Pat's work, it would be that she's, I think you've most often chosen to investigate the historical background to various social issues that we find ourselves debating today. You've written on the NHS, on the history of the welfare state, on the reputation over time of unmarried mothers. You've written about the oldies, the elderly, going right back to ancient times. And you're currently writing about the child poverty action group. So all humanity is there in Pat's work. So I'm going to ask each of them, as I say, to talk for about 10 minutes, no more, if you wouldn't mind, because we want to hear from the audience as well. And I'll aim to wrap up at about 7:30, thereabouts, and drinks await us through there when we can chat all the more before Lawrence whisks the panellists off by then, I have to say, well-earned dinner. So let's start with Ronald Hutton. I'd love to hear, Ronald, your thoughts about the so-called history wave of recent times. Are we really living through a period where there's so much interest in history, and yet people really seem to be living in a bubble of the immediate present? If you put that on your jacket, something like so, and talk to the back of the room, that'd be great.
And I'm your man. There really is no paradox whatsoever in what Dan has set out for you. But the idea that we've lost the past, and yet we wish to immerse ourselves in it. It's the first that generates the second. This was foreseen over 40 years ago by one of the great historians of the generation before mine, Sir John Plumb, in a book called The Death of the Past. And he argued in this that what had happened in the mid-20th century was the pace of technological change had rendered the past obsolete, that until then the past carried enough lessons and value to be a living force in the present. And now at last, modernity had killed it. And in a great moment of optimism, he said what would replace the past was history, as provided by professionals like Sir John Plumb. And I think the first part of that is perfectly right, and I'd enlarge on it. Until the mid-20th century, there were basic skills which most parents could hand on to their children, which would be of some use in their children's life. But not just technical skills, also moral attitudes. For hundreds of years, vaguely based in Christianity, which prescribed attitudes to gender roles, public and private conduct, and sexual behaviour. Jobs were very often arranged for children by parents, at least through providing contacts for them. And the majority were, until the mid-20th century, in manual work of some kind or another. And finally, most people embedded themselves in some sense of community, an inherited community, a traditional community, which defined their identity. And now, even more than in Sir John Plumb's time, the mid-20th century, the work of modernising has been pretty well absolute. Most old technical skills are obsolete. It's very often children or grandchildren that have to teach their parents how to work current technology. Morality has been almost completely altered since the mid-20th century. The job market is now dominated by a huge amorphous white-collar sector into which children generally have to make their own way through education and their own friends. And we have increasingly a vast multi-ethnic, multicultural society based on the individual, the very opposite of a traditional set of communities. So, do historians still have a role to offer history? I'd argue yes, but I'd also suggest that what is replacing the past is heritage. And this is an umbrella term for me of a spontaneous and very effective desire on the part of the general public to engage directly with history. This, I think, takes three main forms, and I'll outline each of them in my remaining time. The first is reenactment and living history. It is no coincidence that it's the period since 1968 in which increasingly numerous and increasingly large societies have been founded across the Western world of people who wish to live in previous centuries or millennia, dressing in the costume for a weekend. And this is vital to their financial survival, providing spectacles, often living history enactments or battle reenactments, which the public is seriously prepared to pay to witness and to engage in. Now, I admit to a vested interest here. Yes, I'm a professional historian, but I also, largely by accident, seem now to be Vice President for life of the Sealed Knot, the Civil War Reenactment Society. They wanted a boffin, but they chose me. It's also the oldest and the largest reenactment society in Europe. And these societies don't just provide public spectacle, they also define communities. They are new communities in their own right. But also they help define living communities among ordinary people on the ground. And there's big money involved. One case of example, 1996, the 350th anniversary of the last sizable battle of the English Civil War at Great Torrington in Devon. And to be blunt, nothing much had happened since at Great Torrington in Devon, which is why most people didn't really know what or where it was. And so the town spent 2 years preparing for the 350th anniversary. For example, the climax of the battle was that the parish church, we got to the climax of the battle afterwards, that was by way of celebration. The climax of the battle was that the parish church blew up because the losing side, the Cavaliers, had stored their powder magazine there, and a parliamentarian, not knowing this, went in with a pipe. Boom. And so the town spent 2 years building a 17th century parish church, complete with pews and a pulpit and everything, simply to blow it up at the end of the reenactment. The Sealed Knot, my society, was invited to supply a battle reenactment and did a scale model of it. Total number of royalist defenders of Torrington, 1646, 1900. The knot fielded 1,900 people in cavalier kit. Size of attacking new model army, advance guard 3,000, it supplied 3,000. So it's a perfect scale reconstruction. And the church got blown up at the end, and everybody was happy. Total cost to Great Torrington, £2 million, preparing for and staging this. Total profit, 6 million in grants and investment afterwards. That's what reenactment can do in hard cash for the local community. It changes things for good by bringing back the past. Second thing is family history, genealogy. The phenomenal urge among absolutely ordinary people to trace their ancestors, formerly only known to aristocrats or to the more pretentious Victorian middle-class entrepreneur desperate for a gentry forebear. Back in the 1970s, when I first began going to county record offices as a researcher, there's almost nobody there apart from myself and a few local historians. By 1990, you had to book for weeks in advance because every reading room was packed out with people hunting for their ancestors. A very vivid testimony of the way in which people who no longer feel saddled with their forebears in the way of advice, techniques, morality, feel the urge to reach out and connect with them. And the popularity of the television show, Who Do You Think You Are, is simply a cherry upon an already very big cake of amateur genealogy. And finally, the use of history as fantasy. I'm not speaking here about the historical novel. That is a fictional work broadly based on fact. The historical novel is actually older than academic history and has retained a big market ever since. I'm speaking about a fantasy world, that is a non-existent parallel world which is imagined by an author that is decked out in the trappings of history. And since the 1970s, note the synchronicity of all this, fantasy of this kind has replaced the detective novel as the most popular genre of fiction in the Western world. Back in 2003, notoriously, Charles Clarke, Minister of Higher Education, is rumoured to have said that nobody should bother about studying the Middle Ages anymore. He has since denied this, not very convincingly. Well, one can be po-faced and point out that any period that gave us Parliament, the common law, and the university system deserves some kind of recognition. But the Middle Ages is also the default position for the fantasy imagination. The medieval reality, in as much as we hazily know it, but also medieval romance, medieval fantasy, is the great mine of material for modern fantasy literature. Think of Lord of the Rings, the Narnia world of C.S. Lewis, Game of Thrones and series after series. These are ripe examples of medievalism in action. And there are various other historical genres on which people draw for this particular way of writing, which I must stress now dominates the reading habits of the Western world. So those are the three forms, I suggest, to which you can look as mass markets for the past, in the form of heritage, consumed in a way it's never been before, because people are now effectively isolated from it. What can historians contribute? The answer is data. The answer is colour. The answer is inspiration. And we've always been pretty good at that. When you look at history on TV, it's always in three forms now. It's in the form of the historical documentary, the docudrama, with people dressed up in period costume acting out the past, and historical fiction, usually a dramatised novel, usually by Philippa Gregory or by Hilary Mantel. In many ways, the Tudors are now the most overexposed family in the British fictional media after the Archers, and increasingly familiar to a much broader audience. So I suppose my answer to the paradox is relax. The past is dead, long live the past. It's all round us now because people are using it simply because they're not saddled with it in the first place. And I find that a comforting way round.
So over to Paul. Just thinking about heritage and reenactment, I was just reading about the reenactment of the Battle of Hastings. I think today is Battle of Hastings Day, isn't it?
Yes.
And next year, watch out, is going to be the 950th anniversary. Imagine the reenactment next year. What the French are going to do about it, I don't know. Over to Paul. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me there? At the back? Excellent. Well, thank you, Ronald, for that. I'm glad you've covered reenactment because that's not on my list of things. It's not something we do a lot of at History Today. But what we do at History Today, and I think this is very good and a very good opportunity for me, and I hope it works for you as well, just to stand back from the typeface and just do a general survey of public history today and any resonances and trends and various other things. And I'll start by being quite pessimistic about the state of history and its effect on public history, but there's comfort in the fact that it gets more positive as it goes on. I can remember the first time I ever engaged with public history was during the early 1970s with The World at War, which absolutely captivated me. It's hard to think that that was shown on a Sunday at about 2 o'clock after football on ITV. It's simply impossible to imagine. But even the people who were involved in that, and I think of Neil Acheson now, took a very jaundiced view of the public's understanding of history. Things really don't change. And in an interview at the time with the early modernist William Lamont, he said this: "The individual knowledge of history is a rubbish tip composed of ill-remembered lessons, television documentaries with half the instalments missed, bodice ripper historical novels, and several jokes about Henry VIII. And some would say that it's hardly improved our wider understanding of history." There are always rather pessimistic surveys that are published every so often. The recent one was of first-year undergraduates at a Russell Group university. I think I do know what that Russell Group university was, where you get statistics such as 66% did not know Elizabeth was Queen at the time of the Armada, that 69% didn't know that the Boer War took place in South Africa, 84% didn't know that Wellington was the commander of Waterloo, and so on. And I did find, and I always do find these figures quite hard to believe, but when I put them to a young Oxford medievalist who was teaching there, he said, "Well, I'm not surprised in the slightest. The general knowledge of undergraduates is appalling." So that's the pessimistic scene one would offer there. There are serious issues, I think, that affect the serious study of history before we go on to the public nature. But the one affects the other, I think, and there's an interaction between them. Geoffrey Parker, who was in our office quite recently, another distinguished early modernist who's based over the United States now, said the key point was that unless they want to study the sewerage system in 19th century Manchester, and that may well be a noble aspiration, historians need languages. But the serious study of history in the UK is threatened, I think, by the collapse in foreign language learning in state schools. In 2013, the last year for which figures are available, just over 4,000 students studied German at A-level. Around 600 will read the subject in some form at university. And the figures are little better for other European languages. The historians Emin Shabal and Stefan Malinowski said that it was virtually impossible to find any British students at top universities who can at least read some German, Spanish, Italian or Portuguese. The languages of the rest of the world barely exist at all, and this is against a backdrop when 40% of the UK universities' language departments are in danger of closure over the next decade. And there are deep and fundamental reasons for this collapse. We know that. It's not just the shortage of modern language teachers, nor the fact that the modern language A-level is considered more difficult than many other subjects, and so it's best neglected by schools with an eye on the league tables. As the Cambridge historian John Gallagher, young historian at Keys now, says, countries which we often display as having a good record in foreign language teaching, such as Finland, have the advantage of a language barely known outside their own borders, and such motivations are largely absent. Will students ever learn a foreign language to a high level when they know they'll never truly need it in everyday life? The figures for classical languages, never likely to fare well in an increasingly utilitarian education system, are even more depressing. About 1,300 students study Latin at A-level, of whom the vast majority are educated in the independent sector, grammar schools, and what we might call the posh comprehensives. And I owe those figures to Edith Hall, who's Professor of Classics at King's, here in London, author of a very fine introduction to ancient Greece, and an eloquent advocate of classics for the people. Hall has argued that languages are not essential to the study of the ancient world, and has made a powerful case for the study of classical civilization courses, leaving the hard miles and pedantry necessary for the teaching of Greek and Latin to those selective private schools. Now, offering the latter, classical civilization courses, this is the ordinary bog standard comprehensive use of it to come with one, while the former, the posh schools, we can call it that, persist in the knottier challenges of language learning of engaging with Homer and Virgil firsthand seems to me to only reinforce that. And as the product of a bog standard comprehensive myself, I'd love to agree with Hall, but I cannot. Parker is right. But I think there's something else that challenges the nature of history as it's seen in the wider sphere, and perhaps this is more important. There are other forms of languages that are being lost. The literature that once surrounded it, and I'm thinking in particular of what we might call the heightened language of Britain. In this I mean things that were imbibed for centuries. The Book of Common Prayer, the King James Version of the Bible, from which one can understand such texts as Paradise Lost, Langland, Chaucer, this kind of familiarity with the strange, the unfamiliar of the past is very much lost. I can remember walking around the National Gallery after a private view with a colleague of mine, highly intelligent colleague at The Guardian, who simply could not recognise the figures that I took for granted in the Caravaggios and the Botticellis and various other things. Classical, perhaps some, the Christian ones barely at all. And this means that many of the best historians of our age, and I think perhaps the greatest historian of our time, a person who may well be the greatest living historian, someone like Peter Brown, for instance, who virtually invented the discipline of the study of late antiquity. Although he's a wonderful prose writer, a wonderful, wonderful articulator, much of what he's talking about may as well be in a foreign language for what most people can have. He simply can't be a public historian because of the gap that's there, even though his writing is wonderful. And so in this sense, I think as Ronald said, Plum was right in saying that the past, the one that we could refer to, that we'd inherited in some way, has become history. And there are other disjunctures here, that while history seems to be ubiquitous on TV, radio, magazines, newspapers, enormous success of literary festivals, the sales of history books, and I think I consider them the bread and butter of history, and I'm sure most of our panel do, are in serious decline. The number, we were just discussing this yesterday at lunch, the number of historians who make a living from writing are very, very few and far between. A handful of names. Amanda Foreman, Tom Holland perhaps, Andrew Roberts, a few others, and they tend to concentrate on traditional themes and biography. Interestingly, quite a few of them are outside the academy as well. And next to this we have the rise of historical fiction, traced in its latest phase, the publication of Mantle's Wolf Hall in 2009, which is in itself, and most of it is nowhere near the classic Mary Mantle's work, is threatening to overwhelm the scholarly, even its semi-scholarly cousin. I also think there's a way in which the wider discourse of the society is affected by the lack of real historical engagement. In other words, understanding what historians do, which is to argue. Because history is forceful and divisive argument. And that, ironically, is why it is such a civilizing activity. It teaches us to cast a cold eye on evidence, to engage with counter-argument, to deal with unpalatable truths. We had a debate within the pages of History Today between a group of people calling themselves historians for Britain, who regarded Britain's history as exceptional, which was headed by David Abernathy at Cambridge, and a group of historians who very much resented that idea of British exceptionalism, who called themselves historians for Europe and others. But even this is a relatively diminished worldview, I think. As the Oxford historian Peter Frankopan said, it is bad enough to read Little Britain type history and to trumpet the idea of trying to build walls around the past, seeking historians to try to knit into a theme of Little Europe, where the West is equally sealed off from the global past, is not much better. We also have, I think, in history, in public history, a kind of apartheid in broadcasting as well. And you see this very much on radio and TV. While there are excellent TV series, David Reynolds has made a number of them, there's no doubt that there's a risk-taking element, a much more serious element in the programmes that are on radio in this country. I think of Neil McGregor's History of the World in 100 Objects, which if anything cried out to be on television, it was that. It was an enormous opportunity missed in my experience. And too many history programmes, I think, are handed down rather than suggest the idea of what historians do, which is debate and argue and contend. Now, we were recently at the Leeds International Medieval Congress, and they had something like this, which was about public history, and medievalists really struggle to find space in public history outside something like In Our Time. And so we tried to come up with a set of rules for public historians to engage with. Just look at time, speed up. One was just don't underestimate your audience, and that has been why Radio 4 in particular, I think, has prospered as an outlet of public history. The second was to steer away from forced parallels with the past, and this was never more evident than during the Greek crisis. And I think we've even seen the comparison between Jeremy Corbyn and the Levels, which is absurd to say the least. And I was saying to someone, let's see who writes the first article in The Guardian about that Ted Vallance obliged. Then, to engage with the strangeness of the past, but be wary of exoticising it. Show the public what historians do, sourcefully, the importance of language to that. 5, probably the most important of all, learn to write. And the 6th one, in order to encourage that argument, that debate, which is so crucial to the discipline of history, whether it's in the academy or whether it's outside with the public, don't worry too much about sensitivities.
Thank you. David Reynolds has, of course, done a great deal of radio and television, as well as a whole series of wonderful books. Projected far corners.
Yes, sir. Right, well, thank you. We didn't conspire in any way on what we were going to say, so it's interesting what's come out and what has not come out and where the overlaps are. There will be some overlaps in what I say, but I will try and move over those more rapidly. I think what I want to do is, first of all, to explore and to some extent endorse Dan's paradox. In other words, that alongside the recent growth of popular interest in history, many people seem to lack the sense of continuity between past and present. But then, perhaps in good academic fashion, I want to question that proposition and move on in a slightly different way. The evidence of popular interest, I think, is very clear and has already been mentioned. Let me just identify some other elements that I don't think have been highlighted so much. With regard to history as heritage, I think it's hugely important that we have two major national institutions, the National Trust and English Heritage, that are in many ways unique internationally, certainly the National Trust is, and which have become major players in the conservation of the past for the present and the future. The National Trust, I think, is one of the biggest landowners in the country. It has grown enormously over the last 40 or 50 years. English Heritage, because of its connections in the past with the government, has gone through various mutations, but again is looking after a large part of the national built heritage. And that, I think, is an important part of the story. I often ask first year students when they come up, why did you want to study history? And very often the answer is, oh, my parents took me to National Trust properties or English Heritage properties, and it kind of got them interested, often in a rather romanticised way. History as reenactment. Ronald has talked eloquently about that, and I'm sure he will take contributions to the seal knot afterwards if you want to donate. Let me add, and we've also heard about history as fiction. I would also create a separate category, which is history as soap, such as Downton Abbey, which seems to me to be a particular example of the problems of anachronism in looking at the past. I had a student essay once on public history, which referred to the programme as Downtown Abbey, which I think was a rather Freudian sort of spelling mistake. So certainly we have a lot of evidence of popular interest in heritage broadly conceived. And I do think there are reasons, as Dan has said, for being concerned about the lack of a deeper historical sense, in various ways. I entirely agree with what Paul has said about the lack of awareness of the role of argument in doing history. That seems to me absolutely fundamental, and most television programs cannot really get into that, as it were, argument side of the whole story. It is more possible to do it on radio. It seems to me one example that's run for a long time is Melvyn Bragg's program, which seems to me, some of those work, some of them don't, but there is a real sense that there isn't a right answer to this, and I think that's fundamentally important. As a teacher, I think what I'm trying to do is encourage students to realise there isn't a right answer. It might be possible to say that there are reasons why we would not accept certain kinds of answers, and we can argue about that. We have a methodology. We're not engaged in fiction, but there is, as Peter Heil said, history is in certain senses argument without end. Hurrah! I'm very happy about that. That doesn't come out in most, I think, much popular awareness and popular presentation of history. But the issue that Dan raised was particularly the sense of continuity, or the lack of continuity, people's lack of awareness of continuity. And it seems to me, I would like to identify two problems here that I think are relevant to this. One is that so much of the production of the heritage industry is really about empathy. It's about feeling like a cavalier or a roundhead, whatever that is. I remember we took some years ago, my son to Kenilworth, where there was a reenactment, and he was fascinated by the fact that this man was was a Viking, but he was also a British BT engineer, and he had, when he pulled up his trousers, he had on some kind of BT boots, and my son found this, I think, a really quite challenging moment of exploring the sort of the problems and relations with past and present. But mostly, this is about empathy. It's not about thinking in a broad, continuous way. And I think another way in which this problem is exacerbated is the media and the media's fascination with anniversaries. So this is, as it were, media moments of history. We have, we're going through this at the moment in the sense of World War I anniversaries. There is a steady, almost creeping barrage of anniversaries that roll on from 2014, 2015 at Gallipoli. Next year we will be blown up by the Somme, and so it goes on. But there isn't necessarily the same sense of understanding of the bigger picture. And it's in fact that bigger picture that I feel is most lacking in much historical education. It's not helped by the modular approach to teaching history in the syllabuses at school. It's also a creeping problem at universities. I still think it is fundamentally important that at many major universities we do teach a big outline course on an area of history, 150 to 200 years, so that at least students get a sense of the spread and the trajectory. So empathy and this fascination with media moments, I think, contribute to the lack of a sense of continuity, a lack of a sense of the longue durée. And that isn't just a sort of an appeal, if you like, for old-fashioned political history. I think the same is true for the longue durée in the sense of social and economic development as well, where you put these fascinating little vignette stories that are so much a part of history on television and so on, and historical novels in a bigger picture of social, cultural, economic development. So yes, popular interest, yes, concerns about lack of continuity. How could one bridge this at least the level of popular history, of public history, which is what we're engaged in today? Two examples that I feel are actually positive. I want to just share with you now. One has been mentioned briefly, but it is the television program Who Do You Think You Are? Which seems to me to have the potential to connect up the fascination with where do I come from biologically and genealogically with the larger story of society and culture. Because the process of following through this story, oh, these are my ancestors, they did this, they did that, takes you into the social history of a family, the social history of what it was like to be a maid in a house or a soldier or whatever it was. It begins to take you beyond the purely familial into the larger story. And because it's question-based, who am I, who are my ancestors, you keep on following through the detective story. And it seems to me that's a way, at a popular level, of linking up the personal, the familial, which is where a lot of people get their interest in history and a sense of history and the historical continuity, with larger patterns. It's rather serendipitous, it's a miss, but nevertheless I think it works. A TV program that I felt worked, the series did this very well, others may have a different opinion, a series Michael Wood did a few years ago. I think it's known as Michael Wood's Story of England, rather like Simon Sharma's Power of Art and all the rest of it. The author and the program are now wedded together. But Michael took a village, I think it was called Kibworth in Leicestershire, and followed the story of that village through from the Romans to the 21st century, using local people to do much of, as it were, the digging, quite not literally at times, but bringing their own stories, their own investigations to bear. It was a strategically well-chosen village. It was on the A5, so it was on one of the major thoroughfares. That's Watling Street, I think, isn't it? That have been, Roman road since the beginning of the since 2,000 years ago. And it was I thought, a very effective way of linking up this personal, local, national stories. And I think those are examples of the way one can do it. But finally, I would just like to ask some other questions about Lawrence's proposition. And I wouldn't put it quite as bleakly as he did. I do think there is, despite all the things I've said and others have said, I think there is actually a vast amount of historical information and historical knowledge out there and produced. And I do think, again, this takes us into, if you like, political territory, but I think a public broadcasting organisation like the BBC has played, on the whole, a very positive part in that story. I think that it has done a number of big programmes that do actually address the question of continuity. I would go back to, say, Simon Sharma's History of Britain, which I remember, I can't remember the week it was, but we'd go in the next morning and listen to various colleagues pulling it apart and saying, Sharma knows something about Rembrandt and Dutch, but God, he doesn't know anything about medieval Britain. And I would think to myself, well, that's possibly true, but my son, who then was about 12, was absolutely riveted by the way he presented Thomas Becket as a street kid from Cheapside and all the rest of it. I mean, it was colloquial, it was very Simon, but it actually brought out the human stories with this big swoop. I thought that was a my feeling was, okay, there's some problematic history here, but I would rather that a large audience hear that than not hear anything at all about history. I also think there is a huge informed audience out there, which we do need to remember in terms of the sociology of the heritage industry and broadcasting and so on. Peter Mangler in particular has written about this, just the consequences of the opening up of higher education since the 1960s, so that there is a huge throughput of history undergraduates, English undergraduates, cognate subjects who are not going on and being academics, but are actually have a serious and critical understanding of what history is about as a discipline. They are, as it were, a serious listening and viewing public, an informed audience, and I think that's part of why there's been so much more history on the public media in the last 10, 20 years. My biggest concerns, and this does go back to Dan's question, and I'm going to end there, is not so much with the public lack of understanding of history, it's politicians' lack of understanding of history. One can go through numerous occasions in the last 10 or 15 years, and indeed, of course, going way back, where simple misunderstanding of history, the use of loose and inaccurate analogies have been fundamentally dangerous. The Iraq War is one of the most egregious recent examples. And I will just draw your attention there to in conclusion, to an organisation which some of you may know, but it's available on the website. It's in fact an entirely web-based organisation, History and Policy, which is based in King's London and in Cambridge, and is an attempt to get historians to offer a historically informed perspective on current problems. I think Pat is one of, are you on one of the trustees or the editorial board or something like that?
I've always been close
okay. And I've had some dealings with it and so on. If you're interested, just Google it when you go home, History and Policy. You will find all sorts of little essays about a historical take on current problems, whether it's the euro or social welfare or whatever it is. And they are engaging now a lot in doing seminars for not so much politicians who don't have the time, but certainly for civil servants of various levels. They work particularly with Treasury, one or two other departments, providing informed historical advice on specific issues. It's not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, but it's a way of engaging, getting historical ideas in at the top, and that seems to me to be really important, in a way more important than the state of public understanding of history in the public at large. So thank you very much.
So, I think this is working, but just pretend that it isn't. Hold that somewhere. Talk to the far. Okay. Shall I hold this for you?
if you like.
Yep.
Okay. Right, I hope I don't sound too croaky. I sometimes do, especially I had a cold not very long ago. Yes. Well, David's rather conveniently introduced the kind of thing I'm going to talk about by mentioning history and policy. Since policy and its history is something I've worked on for most of my career, and I'm going to be giving some examples that sound a bit like the kind of exercises you can see on the History and Policy website. But I've worked on various aspects of social conditions and social policies in the UK over the past 100 years or so, up to the present. I've got a particular interest in connecting past and present, in the belief that we're really going to understand the contemporary world. We need a thorough understanding of its history, how we got to where we are. But of course this understanding needs to be as accurate as we can make it, though, as David has rightly said, our understandings of history are always provisional. Our knowledge of history at any point can be overtaken by new research. But our understanding needs to be as good as we can get. And one thing I find quite disturbing about discussion of various contemporary issues is an all too common way in which people refer to the historical background to current issues, including many politicians. Too often it's couched in a golden age rhetoric. Things were always better in the past, but now we're on the road to perdition. In the golden past, people lived in cosy communities where there was no crime, and nobody ever had to lock their doors, and children respected their elders as they no longer do. And historically, this is nonsense, but it keeps on being repeated. And I'm going to give some more specific examples from my own particular historical interests. Firstly, I write in my work on old age. We hear time and again how, in the past, older people were cared for by their families, but now families just stick them in care homes. In the past, older people were respected, like they no longer are. All the evidence suggests absolutely the opposite. Until some decades into the 20th century, older people often weren't cared for by their grown-up children because they had no children, either because they hadn't married, or given the very high infant and child death rates until the early 20th century, their children might not have survived. Or children may have migrated away to find work, but also mobility is not just a modern phenomenon. It's happened for centuries and centuries. And of course, in the 19th century, they have migrated even further away. The hundreds of thousands who went to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, many other countries. And if they migrated through all those centuries when literacy levels and communications were poor, it was very hard to keep in touch. Now society's mobile, but communications are massively improved. Transports, the internet, the telephone keeps people in touch in a way that was impossible in the past. The past evidence suggests adult children did their best to help their elders when they were still alive and when they could, and their elders helped them. They might all be too poor to do much. At any time to World War II, better off older people would be cared for by servants who were the untrained carers of their day. Also, older people often preferred to keep their independence for as long as possible, rightly judging that it would help them to keep active for as long as possible. Or they might feel apprehensive about living with close relatives. We shouldn't assume that multi-generational living is, now or in the past, always cosy and supportive. There's very sad contemporary evidence from countries where it's still common for older people to live with adult children, like Japan and India, of certainly high levels of abuse of older people. Also, of course, until the late 20th century, people didn't live so long. Until the discovery of antibiotics in the mid-20th century, people often died of infections, chronic illnesses such as strokes and heart attacks, which they can now survive. Now, of course, many more people live to be old. Most older people have at least one surviving child, and at least one close relative living within manageable distance. Long-distance communication, as I've said, is now very much easier. All the signs are older people still prefer their independence for as long as possible. But when they become too frail, most families are supportive up to the point where they really need the kind of full-time care that families don't have the skills to provide. And almost certainly, though we can't exactly quantify it, families do more to support older people here and in many other countries than they ever did or could in the past. Many of the people are alone and lonely, sadly, but they always have been. That also is not a new phenomenon. So if we're really going to understand what's changing as our population ages, which is a major issue in most societies at present, we need a more accurate understanding of what's actually changed, how things have changed over time, and not muddy the discussion with Golden Age nostalgia. Another example is another belief we often hear, that marriage breakup and single parenthood is a modern problem. In the past, people lived in lifelong, contented marriages until the 1960s came along and promiscuous, and marriages and societies became broken. Again, this misunderstands social change. A lot of marriages didn't survive through the lives of both partners through most of history, above all because of the higher death rates, especially of men in early to middle adulthood. Women on average have long outlived men, and were often left as widowed single mothers. The proportion of families headed by single mothers, often in poor circumstances, in the mid-19th century in Britain was very similar to that in the late 20th century, but the reason in the 19th century was widowhood, in the 20th century divorce, separation, or non-marriage. Whatever the cause, there were many families with lone mothers on low incomes and children without a father. It's not easy for children to grow up without a male role model around. Even when a partner didn't die, marriages broke up long before the 1960s. In England and Wales, between the Reformation and 1857, divorce was impossible, except by the expensive process of private act of parliament. After 1857, it was possible, but difficult and expensive, and more difficult for a woman than a man. A man could divorce his wife if she committed adultery. A woman had to prove he'd committed adultery and something else, like extreme violence or buggery or bestiality, something bad, but it had to be something in addition to a very clear sexual double standard. The law was eased somewhat and equalised between men and women in the 20s, 30s, and the 50s, but it still remained difficult until the divorce law reform of 1969. But through all that time, some marriages did prove intolerable, or they did break up. And in fact, a leading argument for divorce reform, which has been consistently made from the end of the 19th century, and put forward by highly respectable judges, bishops, among others, was that so many people were leaving failed marriages and then living in sin with another partner because they couldn't divorce, that this was a social problem that needed to be resolved by making divorce easier. We don't know how many people were living in sin. It wasn't officially registered in England and Wales, and they often, of course, pretended to be married. Though in World War I, the government for the first time gave allowances to the families of servicemen during the war, they quickly realised there were quite a lot of servicemen living stably with women to whom they were not married and often having children. And so they had to give allowances to what they described as unmarried wives on slightly less favourable terms than the respectably married ones, but they still gave them, which suggests it was not an insignificant condition. We do in fact have statistics for Scotland where, as so often, things were different. Divorce there continued to be possible after the Reformation on equal terms for men and women. But it was very hard to remarry because the churches didn't approve. But it was possible to live together as officially registered cohabiting couples And about 12% of Scottish couples were registered in this way at the end of the 19th century, not so different from that of Britain in the later 20th century. And of course, when couples did stay together for ever longer years as life expectancy grew through the 20th century, they weren't necessarily contentedly providing a secure environment for themselves and their children. Women particularly often stayed in unhappy, even violent marriages because they couldn't afford to support their children on their own, given women's poorer work opportunities over a very, very long period. And they lacked custody rights over their children until the mid-20th century. In the 19th century, they gained it over very young children, up to age 7. And it took a very long time for women to have secure rights to the custody of children if they left the marriage, which kept, of course, in marriages. So I'm not suggesting that family relationships are universally ideal now, but rather they probably never have been for all too many people in changing ways. And again, to understand what has changed and what problems may result from changes, we need a much more accurate understanding of what has and hasn't changed, instead of romanticising the past and blaming people in the present. Finally, more briefly, I want to look at an issue of current interest and importance, which is refugees and immigration. We often hear critics of the current restrictions on immigration by refugees from Syria particularly, argue that these restrictions are a betrayal of our great tradition of welcoming victims of war and oppression. I heard it last week about Cooper on Channel 4 News the other evening. I have every sympathy with the critics, but unfortunately our treatment of refugees has not always been so warm. And I just want to take two brief examples. The two waves of Jewish immigration to Britain, from the 1880s to the 1900s, refugees from pogroms in Eastern Europe, then the 1930s and 40s, refugees from Nazism. The first wave of maybe 500,000 people were predominantly very poor. They settled in districts of London and other cities, supported by the established wealthy Jewish community who wanted to protect them from possible antagonism. For example, if they applied for poor relief, the welfare benefits of the day, and to prevent increasing anti-Semitism. But they didn't avoid the hostility. There were demonstrations against them, complaints they didn't speak English, emptied them food, were taking British jobs, British homes, very like now, and with just a little substance, and so mostly hard-working people, many set up businesses, became self-supporting. They were admitted to Britain though, because at that time everyone was, there were no barriers. But the opposition and the protest led the Conservative government in 1905 to introduce the first serious restrictions on immigration. Thereafter, refugees get asylum only if they could prove they were escaping violent persecution, which wasn't always easy. Immigrants who could prove this had to show an immigration officer also that they could support themselves and their families decently, which again was often very difficult. And excluded also was anyone with a criminal record or anyone likely to need help from the welfare system, which again sounds all too familiar. Once they were allowed to enter Britain, they could become British citizens with a permanent right to stay if they could support themselves and paid a fee. But hostility to Jews continued, and in 1914 the citizenship rules were tightened up, and it was only granted to those who could speak, read or write English reasonably well. The later wave of refugees from Nazism tended to be better off than the earlier wave, and were welcomed and supported by many people. They were seen as less of a threat to the welfare system, they didn't need it, but they were thought to threaten jobs, though by different groups than before. This time it was some professionals who felt threatened by these well-qualified, well-educated immigrants. Many academics were welcoming, but others feared the competition. Similarly, some doctors and dentists were very hostile, again, to the influx of qualified competition. And of course, the later 30s was the heyday of Oswald Mosley and the racist black shirts, and there was a great deal of anti-Semitic hostility at the time. Since World War II, as immigration, including refugees, has increased, so has restricted legislation. So it isn't cheering to hear that many British people have been as hostile to refugees in the past as some are in the present, while many were and are welcoming. But I think it's wiser for supporters of refugees to be aware of this mixed and unhappy heritage, rather than being too complacent about our past. And for policymakers to be aware of and prepared for these continuities in responses over time, and not to be guided by golden age sentence. Thank you.